The first scream was swallowed by the wind. Eleanor Hayes didn't remember falling to her knees, only the sudden weight inside her body tightening like a fist that refused to release. Snow pushed through the cracks of the broken shed walls, drifting across the dirt floor, where she lay half-curled beside a stack of rotting hay. The roof above her was split along one beam, letting thin sheets of ice-cold air cut through the darkness. She had tried to make it back from the ration office before the storm hit, but the labor came too fast. One contraction, then another, then no more walking. There was no midwife, no doctor, no husband. Thomas was somewhere in France, and the last letter she received said only that winter had been harsh there too. The irony didn't comfort her. Outside, the blizzard erased the road entirely. No carriage, no truck, no footsteps. The world had narrowed to the inside of that collapsing shed and the rhythm of pain that stole her breath. She pressed her back against a splintered wooden post and tried to remember the instructions the town nurse had once mentioned in passing. Breathe steady, stay calm, keep warm, but calm requires the belief that someone is coming. Eleanor knew no one was. When the baby came, it came violently, a tearing pressure. A flash of white across her vision meant then sudden emptiness, followed by a sound, weak, uncertain, almost questioning. The cry was small, too small. She pulled the child to her chest instinctively, hands shaking, wrapping it inside the thin wool shawl she had worn against the cold. Blood stained the fabric quickly. The wind pushed harder through the broken boards, cutting through both of them. The baby's cry weakened again. Eleanor tried to sit upright, but dizziness forced her back down. She understood something in that moment with frightening clarity. The child might survive the birth, but she might not survive the cold. Her fingers were already losing strength. She tried to shield the baby with her own body, curling around it as another gust slammed against the shed door. Snow scattered across the dirt floor like ash. She whispered apologies to a husband who could not hear her, and promises to a newborn who could not understand her. The crying faded into short, fragile breaths. And outside, the storm kept moving. Unaware that inside a broken shed, two lives were balancing on the edge of silence. The storm did not rage. It pressed. It pressed against the boards, against the roof, against Eleanor's thinning strength until even sound felt heavy. Snow accumulated along the shed's broken doorway, sealing the lower half like a white wall. The wind shifted direction, forcing fine ice through the gaps in the timber and across her face. She tried to wipe it away, but her hands moved slower now. The baby's breathing had changed, not crying, not strong, just shallow pools of air, spaced too far apart. She pressed her cheek to the infant's forehead and felt cold instead of warmth. That frightened her more than the pain ever had. She knew enough about winter in the Midwest to understand what cold could do. It did not kill loudly, it dimmed. It slowed thought. It softened the edges of fear until the body simply stopped resisting. She could already feel that softness creeping into her limbs. Blood loss made the cold worse. The cold made the weakness worse. A cycle tightening quietly. She forced herself to stay awake by whispering her husband's name, repeating it like a rope she refused to let go of. Thomas. Thomas. But the name did not warm the air. Across town, lanterns were already extinguished early because of the blizzard. Most families had shuttered their windows by dusk. Neighbors assumed Eleanor was safe inside her small farmhouse. No one would check until morning, and morning in this storm might be too late. The doctor had left earlier that afternoon to assist a delivery in a neighboring county before the weather turned. The town nurse was elderly and unable to travel in heavy snow. Every possible thread of help had been quietly cut hours before labor began. Inside the shed, Eleanor tried to reposition the baby against her chest, skin to skin, as she had once overheard recommended, but her fingers trembled violently. She attempted to stand, thinking movement might generate warmth, yet her knees collapsed beneath her almost instantly. The room tilted. The roof beam above her blurred. For a brief second, she considered letting her eyes close, just for a moment. The thought frightened her enough to snap them open again. Then, somewhere beyond the storm, faint and distant, there was a sound that did not belong to the wind. Not loud, not clear, but mechanical, and getting closer. The sound grew stronger against the wind. Not thunder, not collapsing timber, but the strained grind of an engine fighting ice. A U.S. Army transport truck, returning from a supply transfer between rural depots, had taken the outer county road to avoid the main highway drifts. Inside the cab, Private Daniel Mercer leaned forward, peering through a windshield smeared with freezing sleet. The storm had worsened beyond forecast, and visibility had shrunk to barely 30 yards. When the rear wheels lost traction on a hidden patch of black ice, the truck fishtailed violently, slid sideways off the packed road, and dropped into a shallow drainage ditch with a heavy metallic thud. The engine coughed once, then stalled. Silence rushed in after the mechanical roar. Daniel stepped down into knee-deep snow, cursing the storm under his breath while assessing the damage. The truck wasn't wrecked, but it wasn't climbing out without assistance either. He considered waiting it out inside the cab until morning, but then he heard something faint through the wind. Not constant, not mechanical. A sound irregular and fragile. At first he dismissed it as shifting metal or the echo of branches snapping under ice weight, but it came again, short, sharp, human. He held his breath to isolate it. There, carried unevenly by gusts, was a cry. Not loud enough to compete with the storm, but too deliberate to ignore. Then he scanned the white horizon and noticed the silhouette of a structure about 70 yards off the road, an abandoned farm shed he vaguely remembered from prior routes. Most men in a blizzard would have stayed with the vehicle. Training emphasized safety, preservation, waiting for daylight. But the sound came again, weaker now. Daniel didn't debate long. He pulled his army coat tighter around himself, adjusted the collar against the wind, then began forcing his way through the snow toward the shed. Each step sank deep, slowing progress. The storm resisted him as if testing the seriousness of his decision. Halfway there, he almost convinced himself the sound had stopped completely. Then it came again, thinner, closer to silence, and he understood that if he turned back now, whatever was inside the shed would not survive the night. By the time Daniel reached the shed, his gloves were stiff with ice, and his breath came in sharp bursts against the freezing air. The lower half of the doorway was blocked with snow, forcing him to shoulder it open just enough to squeeze inside. The wind followed him in before the door thudded shut again. For a moment his eyes struggled to adjust to the dim interior. Then he saw her, a woman on the dirt floor, half curled, blood staining the hay beneath her. And in her arms is the newborn wrapped in thin wool, barely moving. The air inside the shed was only slightly warmer than outside. It would not hold heat long. He dropped to his knees immediately. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened halfway, unfocused, then tried to steady on his uniform. She attempted to speak, but no sound came out. Daniel had basic field medical training, hemorrhage control, shock management, and to battlefield triage, but childbirth in a frozen shed was not part of any manual he had memorized. Still, some principles were universal. Stop heat loss, prevent shock, protect airway. He removed his heavy army coat without hesitation and wrapped it around both mother and child, tucking it tightly around their shoulders and legs, creating a shared pocket of warmth. The coat was thick, insulated, built for Pacific winter nights. It became a barrier between life and the cold. Sammy checked the baby's breathing. Weak, shallow, he cleared mucus gently from the infant's mouth using clean cloth from his supply pouch. The child let out a fragile cry, not strong, but alive. He positioned the baby higher against the mother's chest to encourage warmth transfer. Eleanor tried to speak again, finally whispering that her husband was overseas. The words came broken between exhaustion. Daniel told her to conserve strength. He had no proper medical kit beyond basic first aid, and no sterile instruments, no blankets, except what he could provide. The lantern hanging from a rusted hook flickered as wind seeped through cracks in the boards. The storm outside intensified, rattling the structure violently. He assessed quickly, carrying them now through deep snow. Without stabilizing her could cause collapse, but staying too long risked hypothermia for all three. He focused on immediate stabilization first, pressing folded cloth against bleeding, then ensuring the cord was not twisted or obstructed, keeping both bodies wrapped tightly within his coat. The coat that marked him as a soldier was now their only insulation, and the temperature inside the shed was still falling. The lantern flame trembled violently as another gust struck the shed, shadows shifting across the wooden beams like something alive. Daniel understood that while the baby had been born, the danger was far from over. Eleanor's breathing was uneven, her pulse faint beneath his fingers. Shock was setting in, not just from blood loss, but from cold exposure. He had treated wounded men in field exercises before, but this was different. There were no medics, no supplies, no sterile hospital sheets, only instinct, limited training, and the weight of 2 lives depending entirely on him. He tightened the coat further around mother and child, pulling the heavy wool up to Eleanor's shoulders and wrapping the remaining length around the infant's small frame. Shared body heat was now their only defense. He spoke steadily to keep her conscious. "Stay with me. Focus on my voice." She nodded faintly. The baby's cries faded again into thin breaths. Daniel rubbed the infant's back gently, stimulating circulation. The child responded with a sharper cry, weak but fighting. That sound steadied him. He examined the umbilical cord carefully. It was intact, but loosely positioned. He adjusted it gently to prevent constriction. Blood still pooled beneath Eleanor. He applied pressure using clean gauze from his field kit, improvising compresses from spare cloth strips. He had no proper obstetric tools, but he had discipline, and discipline keeps panic from spreading. Outside, the wind battered the shed with increasing force, snow pressing against the walls until the structure groaned. Daniel weighed the risk again. Staying meant gradual freezing. Moving meant exposure to open wind. He checked her responsiveness. "Can you stand if I carry the baby?" She shook her head weakly. She could not walk. That decided it. He would carry both. He removed the coat briefly, only to reposition it, wrapping Eleanor tightly, securing the baby against her chest, then pulling the coat over both of them again, and fastening it closed around her as if sealing armor. Without his coat, the cold cut through his uniform immediately, but that no longer mattered. He lifted her carefully, one arm under her shoulders, the other supporting the infant. She was lighter than he expected, not because she was small, but because she had already lost too much strength. The shed door resisted at first, and snow packed hard against it. He kicked it open and stepped back into the storm, wind striking his face like shattered glass. Visibility was almost nothing, but behind him, under his coat, 2 faint heartbeats still continued. The wind hit him sideways the moment he stepped clear of the shed, nearly forcing him back inside. Snow lashed across his face, cutting into exposed skin and blurring his vision to a shifting wall of white. He tightened his grip around Eleanor's shoulders, keeping the coat sealed around her and the baby, and leaned forward into the storm. Each step sank deep into the drift, boots disappearing almost to the knee before he pulled free again. The truck was only 70 yards away, but in that visibility, it might as well have been a mile. He focused on one thing: forward movement. Stop, and the cold would win. Eleanor's head rested against his chest, barely conscious. He spoke to her continuously, not because she could answer clearly, but because silence invites surrender. "We're close. Just keep breathing." The baby shifted once under the coat and released a small cry. Fragile, but present. That sound became his compass. He angled slightly left, remembering where the ditch line cut through the snow. Twice he stumbled and nearly fell. If he dropped them, recovery in that depth of snow would cost precious energy. He adjusted his stance, widening his steps for balance, using his shoulders against the wind like a man pushing through surf. The storm tried to spin him off direction, but he forced himself to move in straight lines between faint landmarks he barely recognized. When he finally saw the dark outline of the truck, the relief came only in the form of urgency. The cab door was stiff from ice. He yanked it open and carefully lifted Eleanor inside, settling her across the bench seat while keeping the coat wrapped tight. The baby's breathing was stronger now, but Eleanor's skin remained cold to the touch. The engine refused to start at first. He tried again. The starter groaned uselessly. If the heater didn't engage soon, the cab would become just another cold box. He jumped back out, brushed snow from the hood, then checked the fuel line quickly with numb fingers, then returned to the driver's seat and tried again. The engine sputtered once, then caught weakly. Heat would take time. Too much time. He looked toward town through the windshield, knowing the road ahead was barely passable. Waiting for rescue was not an option. He shifted into gear, eased the truck out of the ditch with slow throttle control, and pointed it toward the faint memory of the county road. Behind him, the storm still raged, but inside the cab, 3 lives were moving toward light. The truck rolled into town just after dawn, its tires crunching slowly over snow that had finally begun to settle. Smoke rose faintly from chimneys as residents stepped outside to assess storm damage, unaware of what had unfolded beyond the county road. Daniel drove straight toward the small clinic near the church square, horn echoing sharply through the quiet morning. The nurse on duty rushed out, eyes widening at the sight inside the cab. A soldier without his coat, a pale woman wrapped tightly in heavy wool, and a newborn barely visible against her chest. Within minutes, Eleanor was inside under proper blankets. The baby examined, cord secured properly, breathing stabilized. The nurse confirmed what Daniel already knew. Without immediate warmth, both would have slipped beyond recovery before sunrise. But towns do not process events only through facts. They process them through whispers. And word traveled quickly that Eleanor Hayes had been found alone overnight in an abandoned shed, and that a soldier had spent the entire night with her before bringing her back at dawn. Some neighbors, unaware of the medical urgency, asked quiet questions. Why had she been out in the storm? Why had he been alone with her? Why was she not delivered by the town nurse? War had made communities tight and protective. Appearances mattered. And the sight of Daniel carrying her into the clinic, the coat wrapped around her body, sparked conversations that had little to do with survival. Daniel did not defend himself immediately. He returned to retrieve his stalled truck and file his transport delay report with the local defense office. He assumed the truth would stand on its own. But by midday, the undertone had shifted enough that the town council requested clarification. Not accusation, but concern. Eleanor's husband was overseas, and the town wanted reassurance that nothing improper had occurred. It was less hostility than discomfort. People prefer simple narratives. This one was not simple. When Daniel learned of the meeting scheduled for that evening, he did not protest. He understood something many soldiers do. Silence can sometimes create more suspicion than explanation. Eleanor, still weak but conscious, insisted she would attend as well, and she remembered enough of the night to know what he had done and what he had not done. By sunset, the church hall lights were on, and the same town that had slept through the storm now gathered to decide how it would remember it. The church hall was quieter than usual that evening. No raised voices, no open accusations, just a tension that hovered between concern and curiosity. Eleanor arrived supported by the town nurse, still pale but steady on her feet. The baby was wrapped properly now, breathing strong, sleeping against her shoulder. Daniel stood a few steps behind, uniform pressed but missing the coat that had never been returned to him. The council chairman opened the floor carefully by stating that the town simply wished to understand the circumstances. It was phrased gently, but everyone understood the implication. Daniel spoke first, not dramatically, not defensively, just plainly. He described the truck sliding off the road, the sound he heard through the storm, the abandoned shed, the state he found her in. He explained the lack of supplies, the risk of hypothermia, and the decision to wrap both mother and child in his coat. He did not embellish. He did not plead. But he simply laid out the sequence of events with the calm clarity of someone who knew exactly how close the outcome had been to tragedy. Then the town nurse stepped forward and confirmed the medical facts. Severe exposure, significant blood loss, dropping body temperature. "Another hour in that shed," she said plainly, "and we would be burying 2 graves this week." The shift in the room was almost physical, and the whispers that had circulated quietly during the day dissolved into something heavier. Realization. Eleanor then spoke, her voice softer but steady. She remembered the cold first, then the coat, then the voice telling her to stay awake. She said she had never felt safer than in the moment she heard the voice through the storm. The words settled into the room like a verdict stronger than any council decision. There was no dramatic applause, no public spectacle, and just a collective understanding that what had been questioned as impropriety had been an act of survival. By the end of the meeting, the chairman formally thanked Daniel for service beyond uniform. It was a small phrase, but it carried weight. Outside, the storm had passed completely. Snow lay smooth and untouched across the square, and for the first time since dawn, the story no longer belonged to rumor. It belonged to truth. The winter of 1944 became one of those stories the town repeated carefully, never exaggerated but never forgotten. The broken shed was eventually torn down in the spring, its wood too warped by snow and wind to repair. Yet people still pointed to the empty field when speaking about that storm. Eleanor recovered fully within weeks, though the memory of cold never entirely left her bones. Her husband returned from overseas the following year and learned the story not through gossip, but through the coat. Carefully folded and preserved, the Army insignia still stitched along the collar. Daniel never asked for it back. The baby, named Thomas Daniel Hayes, grew up hearing the story in measured tones, not as legend but as reminder. His mother would describe the sound of the wind, then the sound of boots in snow. She never dramatized the night. She always said the same thing. He didn't save us with strength, but he saved us by coming when no one else could. The coat remained in their home for decades, occasionally taken down from its cedar box and shown as proof that humanity does not disappear in wartime. It often sharpens. Daniel was transferred months later and continued his service quietly. He never considered what he had done extraordinary. In later years, when asked about the incident, he would shrug and say that soldiers are trained to respond when they hear someone in danger. But those who were there understood something deeper. In a war defined by artillery and headlines, survival sometimes depended on small, unseen decisions made far from battlefields. A truck that slid off the road, a sound that could have been ignored, a coat removed without hesitation. When Thomas Daniel Hayes enlisted years later, he did so wearing his father's surname and carrying his mother's story. At his departure gathering, Eleanor stood beneath a clear summer sky and watched him leave town, the same way she once watched snow bury the road. The difference was this. She knew that even in the harshest storm, someone might still choose to walk toward the cry instead of away from it. And that is how the town remembered that winter. Not for the storm, but for the coat that stood against it.